This is Darling Love, and you're listening to Rodney on the Rock, and he's a rebel.
Good evening, it's 8 o'clock, and I'm for Rodney on the Rock, from now until midnight. Okay, that was MFQ starting off with Rodney on the Rock's traditional theme, This Could Be the Night, a rare Spector track. And that goes out to the film crew from London who are in LA right now. They're doing a film on Phil Spector, and they're trying to track Phil down. I hope they find him. It won't be easy, but I'll keep you informed on their progress. Anyway, this goes out for them.
A ballad, and it would have sounded like, I met her on a Monday and my heart stood still. The do run, 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 the do run, run. And somebody told me her name was Jill. The do run, 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 the do run, run. My heart stood still. Yeah, her name was Jill. And when I walked her home, the do run, 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 the do run, run. Which I have no idea what that means. The do run. It probably means the same thing as do-I-diddy and all those other silly things. Actually, there was a big discussion about whether it should be met her on a Monday and my heart stood still, or met him on a Sunday and my heart stood still. Sunday seems like the day to meet someone and fall in love. But Monday sounds better. Met him on a Monday instead of met him on a Sunday, like where'd that S come from? You know? So met him on a Monday is where it is, and everyone thinks it's Sunday. But it's Monday. It's the only good thing that's ever happened on a Monday.
And you're listening to Rodney on the Rock, and this is the Phil Spector Show. So we've you might say, who's Phil Spector? Well, he's a little guy he's like a teenage millionaire back in the 50s that produced everybody. You name the band, he produced. He's produced the Stones, he's produced the Beatles, of course, all the early stuff of the girl groups like the Ronettes, Crystals, and Darlene Love, and all that in the 60s. You've probably seen him in movies even. He was in the opening scene of Easy Rider when he was the cocaine dealer in Easy Rider, and he's been on I Dream of Jeannie, and he's done everything. Then you heard his group, the Teddy Bears, doing To Know Him Is to Love Him. He formed that group in 1958. Now we're going into the 60s. Here's a big hit that Phil had with Benny King.
There is a rose in Spanish Harlem.
If Phil ever served an apprenticeship with anyone, it was with Lieber and Stoller, and it was with Jerry Lieber that he wrote Spanish Harlem when Phil was in his teens.
Lester Sill, who was responsible, an old and dear friend of ours, who was responsible for getting us into the music industry, took us around, introduced us to all of the independent record company owners, like the people who owned Aladdin Records and Modern Records and Specialty Records. These were all the little record companies that were cooking around the early 50s. Phil Spector was discovered 10 years later by Lester Sill. And Lester gave us a call. We were in New York at the time. And said he had a very talented young man who was rather frustrated with the music scene on the West Coast and really wanted to get with Lieber and Stoller and see what was happening. He wanted to apprentice himself to Lieber and Stoller, and would we consider taking him over?
He seemed a very bright, very sharp young man, very witty, sarcastic. I sensed a rather angry young man, and he dressed like a businessman. He wore a suit and a tie, and looked like he was a young man on the make.
What finally happened was we were called to do Ray Peterson for Big Top Records, and we were really absolutely under with commitments. We were behind, and I thought that would be a great opportunity for Phil to get his feet wet in producing a record on his own. So we convinced the powers that were at Big Top to try Phil Spector out, and he had a big hit right out of the first session. Was Corina. And that was his first independent production under the aegis of Lieber and Stoller as an apprentice. After that, Atlantic became very much interested in Phil Spector. The truth is that after many, many sessions and spending quite a bit of money, he didn't pull any hits out of his hat at Atlantic, and they became very disenchanted. And Phil went on. I'm not sure what the next move was. But
I think the next important move was that he started a record company with Lester Sill called Phil Less Records. As soon as the label became successful, which it did, and became extremely successful, I mean, that was the main string of Phil's hits, he attempted to take over the entire label by himself and get rid of Lester Sill. Which he was ultimately successful in doing.
This spacious mansion is built on one man's capacity for long-range survival in the unpredictable record business. 25 years old, he owns record and publishing companies valued in the millions. He began to compose, arrange, and sing at the age of 16. Dozens of hit records since then indicate that Spector's beat is closely tuned to teen desire.
I myself have a tremendous yearning to be respected, a yearning to be accepted. I see this in the teenagers, yearning to do things, to be someone, to be important, and to be recognized. Difficult to say exactly why anyone would respond to this music, but basically it is an emotional music for an emotional generation.
Spector decided to release his records on his own label. The label was Philly's Records. The LES was Lester Sill.
His talent, number one, best of any producer I've ever met. More imagination. He's a great songwriter. He's a great arranger. Great engineer, great producer. He knows exactly what he wants, and he doesn't stop until he gets it. Never compromises, never. Never did.
See the way he walks down the street, that's the way he shuffles his feet. My, oh, his head up high when he goes walking by. He's my guy. And he holds my hand down so proud, 'cause he's not just one of the crowd. My baby always the one to try the thing they've never done, and just because of that they say, he's a rebel and he'll never be any good. He's a rebel 'cause he never ever does what he should do. Just because he doesn't do what everybody else does, oh, that's no reason why I can't give him all my love. He is always good to me, always treats me tenderly, 'cause he's not a rebel, no, no, no. He's not a rebel, no, 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 to me. If they don't like him that way, they won't like me after today. And I'll be standing right by his side when they say, he's a rebel and he'll never ever be any good. He's a rebel 'cause he never ever does what he should do. Just because he doesn't do what everybody else does, oh, that's no reason why we can't share a love. He is always good to me, good to him I try to be, 'cause he's not rebel, no, no, no. He's not rebel, no, 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 to me. Oh, he's not rebel, no, no, no. He's not rebel, no, no, no,
And that was He's a Rebel. And you're listening to Rodney and Phil Spector. Think of a real pioneer of the rock and roll business, and you'll think of the president of Atlantic Records. And I wonder what he has to say about Phil.
There aren't that many producers today who are producers in the sense that Phil was a producer. Phil was really a man who made the record. The artist was secondary. He needed an artist who could carry on and come out and sing the song. But the artist could be interchangeable. What was important was his concept, the song, and his concept of the production. Two people who really worked closely with Phil when he was making his historic records at different times were Sonny Bono and Nino Tempo, who became sort of disciples of his. And I would suggest that you talk to Nino Tempo, who's a great friend of Sonny's and who's producing records today and has produced some great records on his own.
Phil Spector is a very unusual human being. Certainly not your everyday run-of-the-mill issue record producer. He extremely brilliant, extremely sensitive. The best ears in a recording studio that I've ever come across. He would hear things that only a dog could hear. He'd point something out many times. He'd have to actually point it out for me to hear it. Once I focused on it, then I got it. But he had incredible ears. He was very egotistical, and I don't say that in a negative manner, because I don't believe that he could have made the kind of records he made if he didn't have quite an ego. I think they go hand in hand.
Still no word from Phil yet. Well, I guess it'll take time. But they're off to Studio A at Gold Star here in Hollywood. Stan Ross, Larry Levine will be there to tell them all about the Wall of Sound.
The Wall of Sound
was a descriptive name given by someone else other than Phil. I mean, he didn't coin the phrase Wall of Sound. That Wall of Sound actually came through because at that point in time, and we're talking about 1961 now, just prior to that, or at that time, the most popular records were being made, the hits were being made with a group of 4 and 5 musicians. And so now Phil came in and he brought in a new rhythm section, which included 3 guitars, 2 basses, 2 or 3 pianos, horns.
2 drums.
Well, at that point there was still only one, but actually there were a lot of percussion because anyone that came in to visit the session got put on playing something, percussion usually. So we had all of those people, and now the records weren't being made like that, you see. So there was this Wall of Sound. The Wall of Sound is a function of this studio. There's no doubt about it. The Studio A at Gold Star.
The basic Wall of Sound was the echo chambers, and it was because of overbooking the room with too many musicians. It sounded very small, very, very closed in. And we have acoustic chambers here, and Larry opened up the chambers and started to put every other musician, I think.
The echo chambers never made the sound acceptable. They enhanced the sound, but the fact that the room was filled with musicians, and it is a small room, everything bounced off of, and we got all of this meshing going on, you know. And then you added the chambers to it, and so you got this sound that all became this wall. It was a room saturation. We had it all melded together in the room. And of course, there was one other ingredient to help make it the Wall of Sound. A minor ingredient, but still meaningful. And that's Phil Spector.
Okay, you're listening to Rodney on the Rock. We're still going here. All Grown Up. That was the last release on Philly's record in 1964. Before Phil Spector, there was another record producer, both independent and successful, a man who put Little Richard and Sam Cooke into rock and roll history and paved the way for their imitators. Let's see what a great record producer has to say about another.
Well, I think that he, as a producer, did his job. And he did his job well, and he was got over. What I think of him as a producer in the lights of what I personally, which is my own personal opinion of producers, I didn't give him the esteem that the press and the media gave him. His work was always cliched, and he stole, and I say that with capital S-T-O-L-E, from black musicians, singers, writers, and producers, even myself.
Yeah.
as it happens, I had Darlene on my show last year. She's an amazing singer, and I'm sure she'll have some things to say at the interview.
I met Phil while I was a background singer. I met him through a gentleman named Lester Sill. I was doing work for Lester Sill at the time, and Phil was in town from New York City looking for someone to record He's a Rebel. With me, Phil was a very easygoing person. I didn't have all the trouble and the problems everybody else had. When I went into the recording studio to sing or to perform, that's what I was there for, and I never really had any problems with Philip. He would tell me the way he wanted me to sing it, and I would do it. If he had a problem, the words or whatever weren't coming out right, or he couldn't understand them, he would stop me and tell me. But we would usually go into the studio, and within 1 to 5 takes, I was finished.
Every evening when the sun goes down, I lay my head.
Darlene? I don't have to have oohs behind it, okay? Let's forget about the intro for now. Let's just come right in. 1, 2, 3.
Every evening when the sun goes down, I lay my head on the pillow down. Every evening when the sun goes down, I lay my head on the pillow down. You gonna keep that other part the same?
Yeah.
Me in business. Now that's a different story because see, like when I got with Phil, like when I did He's a Rebel, it was already understood I was getting paid $1,500 to do the record, which was fine. When the record was such a big success, we signed contracts. In those days, a contract was only as good as how powerful you were. I'll put it that way. If you had the money to get out of contracts, you could get out of them. In those days, nobody was running around trying to get out of contract if something bad happened or you weren't getting along with the producer or you weren't getting paid. So between 1963 and 65, I was signed to Philip. I got one royalty statement from Philip for $3,000, and that was it. I never got another dime from Phil. That's when we started not really getting along. And back in those days, like 20 years ago, it didn't bother me as much then because I was young, inexperienced, and never thought at the time that I was being used or whatnot by Philip. It wasn't until years later that I started feeling like that I was really being used by Phil because the records were still being produced and still being put out under my name, under the Crystal's names, under Bobby Sox and the Blue Jeans name, and nobody was getting paid. And I was just feeling that I was really being exploited now at this time. Here it is 20 years later, and I'm still not getting any money from Philip. And I think enough is enough.
Moving right along to the Phil Spector show, well, here's Cher. From pizzas to promotion to production, the other half of Cher, what's Sonny Bono going to tell them about Phil Spector?
I was a promotion man. I went and got the records played, and I worked at the distributorship that handled his product. And it's always nice for a promotion man when you can walk into a radio station, give them a record, and they're just dying to play it. Usually, it's the opposite. You know, you have to take them to dinner, give them money, choke them, anything to get a record played, but they were always happy to get a Phil Spector record because they always knew it would be a hit. So it was such a treat to do that, and I was just absolutely mesmerized by his records. So he used to come from New York once in a while, have meetings on the product, and when he did, I just was determined that I was going to go to work for him. So I just told him, I said, Philip, I want to work for you, just you. And I told him I'd work for any amount of money for any amount of time. And so he was happy with that, and he worked me for no money and a lot of time. I think his downfall was that he duplicated himself, his sound all the time. And I think when Philip and I broke communication, when I was his promotion man, I said, Phil, I think we've got to change the sound, because after a certain period of time, it didn't get the same reaction that it did for a couple years, you know. Then we kept duplicating this one single sound. After a while, nobody had the enthusiasm that they originally had, you know, and as the enthusiasm dropped, then it became a problem getting those records played. That was something he just didn't want to confront, you know, having to go with a different sound. And frankly, I don't know if he can. You know, basically everything he's ever done is beautiful, but it's basically all that big wall of sound.
Please, Phil Spector, make me a star. Help me get up where the righteous brothers are.
Let's see what the goddaughter of Phil Spector has to say about her goddad. She's the daughter of Lenny Bruce. And Phil, if you're listening, give these guys a break, huh?
Mr. Spector, I get down on my knees to you.
For everybody that's watching this, what I want you to know about Phil Spector is that, number one, that he's a good father. He's a real good dad. And he takes care of his children, and they have dinner together, and he's a good man. He's a good person. He paid for my father's funeral. He loves to decorate. He takes care of his house. His house is, everything is in velvets, and it's very important to him how things are decorated, because it looks like a mausoleum, that house.
I'll get down on my knees for you. If you would only love me like you used to do. We had a love you don't find every day. So don't let me slip away. Baby, I
Phil Spector's music is yesterday's hits today. This is Holly and Italians, Holly Vincent, doing A Chapel of Love. It's written by Jeff Barry, Ellie Greenidge, and Phil Spector. Kind of a heavy metal twist. Here's Legs Diamond doing the Righteous Brothers hit, We Lost That Love and Feeling.
Now there's no welcome look in your eyes when I reach for you. And girl, you're starting to.
Patti Smith from a concert in 1978. Of course, did a salute to Phil Spector. And the California sound of the Beach Boys. And of course, Brian Wilson is noted for borrowing Phil Spector's sound. Here's the Beach Boys doing Then I Kissed Her also. And even myself recorded a Phil Spector song. Then I Kissed Her, produced by Dan Phillips and David Scott, who are Barney Kessel's sons. Not only is this next one a cover tune, but this one was actually produced by Phil Spector at the Gold Star Studios. Of course, Dan Ross and Larry Levine were on hand for the Ramones doing Baby I Love You. And of course, Phil's music is still going on and on today. It will never die. John Cassidy has done it, Mick Jagger. And there's even more bands out there today doing even more tunes. Phil Spector, where are you? You know, this next thing is just like so rare, I can't even begin to tell you how rare it is. It just never came out. It's actually the first session that Dan Phillips and David Scott actually got to play on that Phil produced John Lennon, because Phil did a lot of John Lennon's big hits like Imagine and Instant Karma, all those Phil did. Anyway, Phil did a rock and roll album with John Lennon, and here's a song that's not on that rock and roll album, and it's John Lennon doing Be My Baby, produced by Phil Spector.
Did some cuts on that John Lennon rock and roll album that he did, which were phenomenal. And
that was the first thing we did with Phil, actually, was the John Lennon stuff. Yeah.
But even though he said, come down, we're going to do some stuff with Cher, it ended up being John and all that kind of stuff. And from there, we did a bunch of sessions with him. And really got into, like, really deeply production, which we really hadn't considered at that time, which was a whole new game. And to see it done that way was just different. The John Lennon sessions were pretty amazing, as you might expect. Like, John was really in a seriously aggressive mood in those days, and Phil was always has been very aggressive, and a lot of great musicians, a lot of good music. I guess that's kind of a starter.
Yes, David and I played electric guitar, rhythm guitar in those sessions, and probably some of the greatest sessions that we've been involved with. The artistic tension was really present there between John and Phil. They worked well together, and the chemistry was there, but there was also, like I say, a tension between the two of them.
I think it was an artistic tension of one wanting to go one way and one wanting to go the other way, and you usually have that with any artist-producer relationship, but with those two people, it just got very intense.
It started out with John asking Phil, or telling Phil, like, I just want to be like Ronnie Spector, like, go for it.
I guess one of the main things I'd have to say about Phil, like modern day wise, is that he's very active. He's in the studio a lot when people don't know he's in the studio, and he really doesn't feel pressured or obligated to make a record just to be like currently on the charts right this second. I don't think that really relates to Phil Spector. Phil Spector is an artist, and he can make a record whenever he chooses to. It's just like saying Picasso didn't do a painting this week, so therefore he's past and has been, which is really wrong. I know a lot of people like discount Phil after the Phyllis era, but when you consider all the hits he's had with the Beatles, various members of the Beatles, singular, like Grammys, George Harrison, John Lennon, etc., when you consider the Ramones he did, which is their biggest selling LP they've ever had, when you consider that Yoko Ono asked him to please come and help finish her solo album after John died, that's pretty current, and that's pretty selective as to the type of work he wishes to do.
I'll tell you a story about the Ramones. We were in the studio with them at Gold Star doing some recordings with them, and we were on our way over to Phil's with all four of them. Joey was game for it. The other three, they started to get weird, and they said, oh, no, you can go, Joey. We're not going to go. We're not going to get stuck up there all alone up there in that house.
Because they'd been up there before, and they kind of felt that they got trapped up there or something, when actually I think they were lucky to be up there, because when we got up there, okay, the other three bailed out at the Tropicana, which is where a lot of the bands stay, and we went up to the house with Joey. And I remember Joey was saying, gee, Phil, I really want you to produce us because we need a big-name producer for our new album, because Seymour said we need a big-name producer and it'll help us sell. And I think a point about a producer versus Phil Spector is Phil said, well, if you need a big-name producer, go find one. If you want Phil Spector to produce you, then I'll consider it.
If you really want to know more about the Ramones and Phil Spector and those sessions, perhaps you ought to ask the Ramones.
Well, working with Phil is very difficult because I guess he's a perfectionist, so he likes to spend a lot of time redoing things and re-listening, and it's very time-consuming. It becomes very hard for, rock and roll's got to be spontaneous and done a little faster.
I like beauty to be instant, not to be labored over, and I don't like music to be a hustle. I think we can adequately go into a studio and do it and not just be frustrated, and Phil seemed to be frustrated with us.
I think he's frustrated with himself, really.
He wasn't the most friendly guy I've ever met. He tried to be friends, but then he had a guns on him, and he wouldn't let me out of his house for a couple days, and he wouldn't let. And then if he said if you want to play his pinball machine, he'd let you play it for a minute, and then he'd say, okay, everybody to another room. And I never met anyone like him, and I hope Now,
he's just too difficult to work with, and it's too costly and time-consuming, and in the 1980s. You can't spend, the opening chord to a song of Rock and Roll High School, he spent 12 hours sitting there listening to that same chord over and over again. It's just not worth it. And nobody else could hear the difference. The chord came out sounding okay, but 12 hours worth ain't really worth it, You just go crazy. You would be as crazy as him if we worked with him again.
Rock and roll high school, that's not where I
times have changed, and most producers from the mid-'60s haven't really grown with the changes. They're not able to do what producers now can do. There's a new modern sound, and he doesn't have it.
No.
His time's passed. We wanted to work with Phil because I mean, the guy is a legend, and we thought it'd be a very good idea to work with a legend. And you never know when it be his last project. And plus, we didn't really know how difficult it is to work with the guy before we stepped into it. We found out.
You know, like when before I wanted to work with him 100%, and I was gung-ho for the project, but he came off differently. He seemed more positive and more able. And when I got into the studio, I found him to be like a helpless little boy or something, like a very helpless person. He didn't know what to do. And that just stifles creativity when you just hang around in agony and frustration and stomp your foot and say, oh, what are we going to do? And all. You know, that doesn't bring out anything in anybody.
I guess faced with the project, he was very enthused, and then when she gets to that all of a sudden now it's the time, I guess then he must get a bit nervous about that all of a sudden it's getting near the time where he has to put out a project which is going to be criticized.
He seemed like a man.
Then, you know, then it becomes very hard. It gets harder and harder for him to finish the project from the time at pre-production.
He seemed like a man walking his last mile doing our record, you know, that grim.
Hi, this is Ronnie Spector, and you're listening to Rodney on the Rock on KROQ FM.
As Ronnie Bennett with her sister and her cousin. Phil Spector called them the Ronettes.
He wanted somebody to sing backup, singing from in New York. And we jumped to the chance. And we called him. And we said, we sing backup and stuff. So we met him a couple of days later at the place called Mirror Sound on 57th Street here in New York. And first meeting was just him and us, the three of us. He was sitting at a piano. And he just said, sing what you usually sing. And so we started singing a little three-part harmony stuff. He said, well, do you know anything like, like any of the, like rock and roll songs? And I said, well, I know Frankie Lyman's stuff by heart, and all that stuff, Little Anthony. He said, well, let me hear it. And I started saying, why do birds sing so gay? He said, that's the voice.
Well, I think Phil was a very normal person at the very beginning of his career, just very dedicated and very determined. But as time went on, they started writing about him being a genius. And then he said, yeah, I am a genius. This is the thoughts that I was, as living with him, that I was thinking, because I was watching him. And then they would say he's the mad genius, so he became the mad genius. I mean, it was anything they wrote about him. He's a recluse, so he became a recluse. I mean, this is my opinion. I think if Phil hadn't read anything about himself, I think he would still be the same. But that sort of destroyed him because he became a replicate of everything he read about himself. I wouldn't say he's mad. A lot of times I think he's pretending to be, because I've seen him straight, like we're going someplace, and then I've seen him act that weird way of his. So a lot of it is intentional. A lot of it may be mad, but a lot of it is certainly intentional, to let people wonder about what is this guy all about. I think he's always wanted attention.
And I think he's also always wanted to be an artist on his own. He just didn't have the talent or the voice. Because after all, he started out with a teddy bear, so it shows you right there, he wanted to be a performer himself. But he couldn't, because he didn't have the talent for that. But he had the talent for producing and writing, so he did that. I think he's not working now, but partly because of his pride. And he's afraid, because he doesn't, if it's not going to be a hit, you know, he's just like, he's afraid. Because he did a few things with the Ramones and Cher, and they weren't successful. So I think he's afraid, like the name that he has, he wants to maintain as being that genius and that mad genius. And I think he's actually afraid to go back in the studio, afraid that it may not become a hit. And people would start saying he's not such a genius, and he wants to keep that title.
Well, Phil Spector is really the voice of a whole era of American popular music. This was the era that followed upon the first advent of rock and roll in the early 60s. After the rockabillys and the hard rockers and the Little Richard types and so forth had sort of been wiped out by a big wave of disapprobation, a moral panic, you could call it, symbolized by the payola scandal. The slate was sort of wiped clean, and rock had to resume on a different basis. There was this great hole, this declivity, and Phil Spector filled that space. The space between Elvis and the Beatles was Phil Spector's. Well, of course, Phil was famous for a thing he called the wall of sound. And recently I went back and I reviewed Spector's records, which are now available in a big compendious collection. And I was astounded, I was shocked at how horrible these records really are. They're a monument to what we call in America schlock. You know, it's musical garbage on such an abundant scale that you're sort of awestruck by it. Rock and roll is basically institutionalized adolescence. And the bottom line of rock and roll is that it's a baby food industry. And Phil found a new formula for baby food.
Phil made a record that he wrote by himself called When I Saw You, which was written for me. And it was the only song that he wrote with no other co-writers. And it was obviously he had written it just for me. And it went something like, when I saw you, that's when I knew I'd lose my mind over you. And it kind of happened to him. Not meaning losing his mind over me, but just losing his mind.
Phil never showed up for the film crew. I guess he's got other things in his head. But we got some Spector stuff to do here. Here's something unusual. This is a song that Phil did with the Crystals called Do the Screw in order to kill a contract or something, with Phil Spector's lawyer yelling out, "Do the screw." And here it is.
Let's dance the screw, part 1.